Thank you very much for the introduction, Paul. So today, almost 4 weeks after the start of this war that shocked the world and continues to do so, the world is realizing that this war will not be over quickly, and that, even if it were, the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine threaten to affect for years everything from international politics to food prices. We're going to begin today with brief introductory comments from the panelists. We'll then have a brief discussion up here, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. So I think, Michael, can you hear us? Can Michael hear us okay?
Oh, no, not just yet.
Okay. In which case, Anne, let me come to you first, please. So your thoughts on where we are at the moment.
So first of all, thank you very much. It's nice to see so many people here at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when you should all be at work, as should probably all of us. I mean, I think the most important thing to say about the conflict is it's very important to keep focused on what was the cause of it, because that will help us understand what is our responsibility for ending it. This was a conflict that is born out of, it's not quite Vladimir Putin's brain, but it's really the collective brain of the disgruntled and unhappy Soviet apparatchiks and former KGB officers who were dissatisfied by the collapse of the Soviet Union, who perceived, and at that time and perceive even now, the fall of the Berlin Wall to have been a terrible disaster, who think that the rhetoric of democracy, the language of freedom and rights, the language of freedom and rights, that those are a threat to them and a threat to Russia. And because they have identified themselves as the true guardians of Russia, they see all these things as the sources of, as enemies. This explains both Putin's growing animosity to the West, to the Western world. After 2011, when there were demonstrations in Moscow, he made a very strange series of speeches, very emotional, in which he accused Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and other Western leaders of attempting to overthrow him. Because in his mind, there is no such thing as an independent crowd. There is no such thing as a spontaneous movement. There are no real movements. There are no real politics at all. Everything is orchestrated. And so he perceived that as an orchestrated attack on him and on Russia. He then perceived the revolution in Ukraine in 2014 as exactly the same thing. So he perceives Ukraine as a false state and as a carrier of a kind of Western virus that he fears will inflict him. And because the nature of that, because it's so existential for him, I think that is what makes this war so dangerous. He very much sees it, and his foreign minister a couple of days ago said this as a geopolitical, tipping point. This is a moment when everything will change. His form of kleptocratic autocracy will triumph over weak and divided Western democracy. He will occupy a state that he feels is not real, and he will play the role, Russia will play the role that he thinks it should play and that it hasn't played since 1991. It is a direct challenge to all of our institutions and all of our beliefs about the world. It is a challenge to our beliefs in the inviolability of borders, in the rules and morals that have governed Europe since the end of the Second World War. It's not just about democracy, it's also about principles of international law and human rights. And so he sees it as a direct challenge to us. The Ukrainians have also perceived it that way and have been very eloquent in describing the war that way as well. And I think that is it's that understanding that I think is finally taking hold in Washington and London and Berlin. As we realize that this is a challenge that we can't escape.
Thank you very much. Sir Michael Fallon, you were British Defence Secretary at the time of the Western campaign against Daesh, so-called Islamic State, but a rather different challenge emerging in this case.
Absolutely, and thank you for inviting me. And I can't match Anne's eloquence. She's right, of course. to put the blame for all this onto Putin and the people around Putin, and to look back at the history of this. But I would just like to take a moment to look back at our initial response, because I think we are failing Ukraine and did fail Ukraine. And I think there are lessons for us. And then perhaps just a word on how we go forward from here, if I may. The Orange Revolution was 2004. That was the point at which Europe could perhaps have done something. There could have been a really substantial and persistent package of social and economic aid to reform Ukraine, its agriculture, its industry, and its government. We didn't do that. We said we welcomed a democracy. We didn't do anything about willing the means. When it came to 2014 and the annexation of Crimea and the incursion into the Donbass, we didn't do much either. The Ukrainians came to the NATO summit that year pleading for weapons to aid their defense. We refused them. I was refused by the coalition government here to supply any defensive lethal weapons. That's why we switched to training the Ukrainian army, because we weren't allowed to supply lethal weapons. It now emerges that since 2014, at least 10 European countries have not only refused to supply the Ukrainians with arms, but they've been supplying the Russians with arms over the last 8 years, finding loopholes in the European sanctions. And we now can see more clearly how those sanctions were inadequate. They didn't include oil and gas, and we can now see how allowing the Kerch Straits to be bridged in the way it was, those eastern ports of Berdyansk and Mariupol, which I visited, have been essentially throttled. We let all this happen on our watch, and there were things we could have done that I think we now wish we should have done. And if you go to eastern Ukraine, as many of you here will have done, you do see a left-behind land in which companies aren't eligible for EBRD support or EIB lending, where the infrastructure has not been improved, where heavy industry relies on single track, steam-hauled railway, and all the rest of it. So, of course, Putin is to blame for all this. But we have let Ukraine down as well. Now, what should we be doing now to get out of this? It seems to me, having lived through some of this, that Putin will now do as he's done elsewhere. He will double down. He doubled down in Chechnya. He doubled down in Syria. He doubled down in the Donbass itself. I think he will continue to double down. But equally, he may now have to settle for less than he originally wanted. And I think there's a clue to that in the transcript of the Putin-Erdogan conversations, that there may be a way that a well-placed mediator may now start to explore some of the ground, some way off, but may start to explore that successfully, whether it's Xi, whether it's Erdogan, or whether it's the Israeli Prime Minister. And I think that's where the British government ought to be focusing its attention, particularly in Ankara, where it stands particularly well. Second, we should continue the military aid. We should absolutely be getting as much military aid in there as possible, and indeed going further, helping to continue to advise and to train. Thirdly, the burden, of course, an appalling price is being paid in Ukraine. The burden of a lot of this is now going to fall on Poland. And I think we and the European Union should now be considering urgently what more we can do to help in Poland. My successor is sending weapons there. That's important. But we will need, I think, to help strengthen the Polish economy and share part of the cost of all this. And finally, you'd expect me to say, as a former defence secretary, we've got, of course, to look at our own defence. We boast about meeting the NATO target, 2.1%. Romania's target, by the way, is 2.5%. Romania's target. If you go back to the last year of the last century, long before 9/11, before Daesh, before Iranian and North Korean missiles, before any of this Russian aggression, we were spending 2.7%. We will now have to look to our own defence.
So, Michael, thank you very much. Edward, I will come to you in a moment. I just think, do we have Michael Bosicu? Can you hear us from Lviv? I think you can hear us. We can't yet hear you, unfortunately.
Can you hear me? Can you hear
Yes, we can, yeah. Yes.
me? Okay.
Thank you so much for joining us. Please go ahead. Your thoughts on the war at this stage, please.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I'm here in Lviv, Ukraine. And just a few minutes ago, the air raid sirens stopped blaring. I have to say, for the past 2 days, they've been going off intermittently, often, more than we've ever had. I'm not quite sure the reason for that, but it's gotten pretty much to the point where I think people aren't paying attention to it very much, which of course is a very dangerous thing should the worst happen. Anyway, so tomorrow will pretty much mark 1 month since the war began. And on the doorstep of Europe, in a city called Mariupol, where in 2022, people are killing stray dogs for food. People are killing stray dogs for food. They're having to melt snow, what little is left, for water, and a lot of the water sources there are contaminated by dead corpses. That's how bad things are right there on the doorstep of Europe. Now, the actions of the Russian Federation in places like Mariupol and now Kherson are clear terrorism, grave violations of international humanitarian law. And if there's any positive news to share with you, it looks like the Ukrainian side is taking very strident efforts to document all of these human rights, these war crime violations, because of course that will be very important later on. And of course, journalists and war photographers are playing a very important role in that. Forgive me for hopping around a bit, but a lack of sleep does that. But I'll just put a few key points out there. Of course, one of the things that tends to happen during war, and we saw this happen in the Donbass quite intensively 2014 onwards, is heavy mining. And at the moment, according to the Ukrainian Deminers Association, the size of the area of Ukraine that is mined is actually now larger than the size of Scotland. This is really important because even though mines aren't concentrated perhaps in one area, the planting season here is about to begin. And we've seen in Afghanistan and elsewhere where even a small amount of mines in one area can really discourage normal activities such as agriculture. So that is something that is not very good news at all. Many of you have probably read that the casualties on the Russian Federation are getting very, very high indeed. According to an article that was briefly in the Russian press, Russian killed in action are around 10,000 now, and injured in action 16,000 plus. What we're also seeing on the battlefield is very poor preparation and planning. For example, even things right down to the tires used on Russian Federation Army vehicles, the maintenance, small things like changing oil aren't being done. So you're having massive breakdowns here to the point where the Ukrainians are benefiting from a lot of this battlefield equipment being left on the side. They actually have a scrapyard now in Kyiv where they're rehabilitating these pieces of equipment for their own use. In terms of areas that we should be concerned about, I mentioned Mariupol, and even though there have been arrangements to evacuate people from there, the Russian Federation has been shooting at the convoys that have been leaving. We're also seeing a trend that is very worrying of people being forcibly told to leave for the Russian Federation. And once they get there, we don't know what happens to them. And that includes children as well. Kherson is a big problem, city of about 300,000 in a very strategic area. Food and medical supplies there are running out. And in terms of Kyiv, it looks like the Ukrainian forces are doing a good job in terms of defending the city. But having said that, recently in the past 24 hours, we had that horrible shelling of the Kyiv shopping center, which, by the way, is only a 10-minute drive from the city center. And just in the past couple of hours, I believe it was, the mayor of Boryspil, which is the airport satellite town near Ukraine's biggest airport, the residents there have been told to evacuate. That town is actually home to a lot of airport employees, airline employees, so that's how close the forces are getting to Kyiv. Kind of quickly to look ahead, I've already mentioned the poor battlefield performance, and I think what that's going to prompt is use of more long-range weapons, including possibly the hypersonic weapons, which are very, very difficult to interrupt or to destroy. We're going to see more use of unguided missiles, which cause terrible destruction in populated centers, and the Russian playbook of bombing cities into submission. I also want to remind everyone that we often talk about the mass migration of people, of asylum seekers to places like Poland. The numbers now could possibly reach as high as 10 million, and that is almost 10% of the Ukrainian population. Having said that, the numbers have calmed down quite a bit in the border crossings closer to Lviv. We're seeing around, I think, 500,000. Sorry, we're seeing numbers where you'd see closer to pre-war. I think what the Russians are going to do in terms of strategy is trying to focus on that land corridor that links Crimea with the Russian Federation. So obviously that will behoove us to keep our eyes closely on Odessa. Finally, as you know, the President Zelensky has raised the prospect of peace talks. Happy to answer questions about that, but a lot of the Ukrainians I talk to here and what I'm hearing on the Ukrainian television broadcasts is there's a lot of nervousness about him entering into peace talks, just because that the Russians are not knowing, are known rather for putting down quite unreasonable demands. These concessions will be very difficult for President Zelensky to meet, and I'm talking, for example, holding on to, going back to territory that Ukraine had pre-invasion, but also there's talk of President Zelensky being pressured to go back to 2014 and demand return of the Crimea and Donbass, which he probably should. And I think I had one more last point here. Oh yes, one more last point. I think someone mentioned the no-fly zone. We had an Atlantic Council panel yesterday, and I think it's widely recognized that the no-fly zone is a non-starter for the West. They're too afraid, for whatever reason, to prompt Mr. Putin into using nuclear weapons or chemical weapons. But I think the West should be looking at technical means to put a no-fly zone over at least Western Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily mean having to put aircraft over the skies here to defend that no-fly zone, but things like a partial Iron Dome system, technology like that. Thank you.
Michael, thank you very much. I'm quite sure we will be back to you shortly with some questions. For now, thank you for an overview which was comprehensive, if in places distressing in its detail. Edward Lucas, amongst your many roles previously, you were Russia editor of The Economist. You've watched and written about Russia for a long time over the last couple of decades. How do you assess the situation where we are now?
Well, I think it's not quite the end of the world, though that may yet come. It's the end of a world. It's the end of a world that I think everybody in this audience, unless they're in their late 90s, has known all their lives. A world that started with the Berlin airlift, marked by the growth of NATO and the EU and the relationships between even at the depth of the Cold War, a kind of predictability about relations between East and West. This is more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis, for those who remember that. Khrushchev wasn't threatening the use of nuclear weapons to get what he wanted. He had a fairly reasonable objective and was doing something the Americans wouldn't like in the hope that they would do it. And if you think this last month has been bad, and I talked to many people just beforehand who were saying this has been the worst few weeks of their lives, and that's here in Britain, let alone what it's like if you're over there. I have to say, I think the worst is yet to come. I think we're facing the most ghastly, costly, risky, unpleasant, traumatizing weeks and months ahead before anything begins to get stable, let alone better. But how did we get here? What's so odd about this is Russia's fundamentally quite weak. Russia's got an economy about the size of Italy, depending on how you measure it. The West is so much bigger, so much stronger, in population terms, in GDP terms, in military terms, than Russia. How did we get to a stage that Russia was able to do this? And what's particularly odd is we were warned. We were warned again and again and again. I'm very glad to hear Sir Michael mention the missed opportunity after the Orange Revolution. But in 2004, That was 2004. 1994, Lennart Meri, the now dead Estonian president, gave a brilliant speech at a conference in Germany, lamenting the West's cynical and naive response to what was then called the Karaganov Doctrine. I'm not sure anyone in the audience will even remember that. The Karaganov Doctrine was, he was an advisor to Yeltsin, who said that Russia had the right and the duty to interfere in the affairs of neighboring countries in order to protect what he called the rights of Russian speakers. Now, of course, Russian speaker is not a category in international law. I'm a Russian speaker, and Anne's a Russian speaker, and you're a Russian speaker. None of us want Putin to intervene on our behalf. But that's not the point. It created this idea of compatriots as a political category. And right back then, we didn't do anything because we were ignorant and arrogant and cynical and naive, as Lennart Meri said, and also perhaps rather timid. And I think that's been the hallmark of our approach. We are now at a stage where we have no good options. Everything we do has appalling risks and costs. And I think that we in the Old West, and I mean here Berlin, Brussels, Paris, London, Washington, D.C., need to look at this with a degree of humility and contrition, that Ukrainians are paying the price in their thousands of deaths, tens of thousands maimed, hundreds of thousands, millions of lives shattered, traumatized for a generation to come, because we didn't listen when we were warned. And we didn't just ignore those warnings, we patronized and belittled the people who were delivering them, people like Václav Havel. And I've sat in the room where this has happened. I've watched German officials laugh out loud when they were told that energy could be used as a weapon against Germany. I've watched officials laugh out loud when they were told that information could be used as a weapon. I've watched officials laugh out loud when they were told that Russia was a military threat to its neighbors. All these things happened, and it's our fault. You can blame Putin as much as you want, but Putin it's like a kind of savage animal. If you let the savage animal into your house, ignore warnings that it's savage, allow it to run riot, and then it bites someone, well, okay, the savage animal is at fault in one sense, but boy, are we at fault here. And it's particularly annoying when we are so self-centered about it and bemoan the very minor burdens that we're bearing here. One could go into some length about why this is, why Eastern Europe, so-called, was a kind of grey zone that nobody knew about, why we didn't have, all our expertise was focused on Russia and the Soviet Union rather than on the countries in between. I think we can leave that for another time. I'm particularly want to focus now on escalation, because one of the many strands of our appalling approach to this is we've always preferred not to take risks. So when it was Yeltsin, we said, we don't take the risk of the communists coming back. Let's push Yeltsin too hard. Let's push Primakov too hard. Before that, of course, it was don't push Gorbachev too hard. We're always more frightened of escalation than we are of Russia getting what it wants. And I'm sorry, because I had high hopes of the Biden administration. I think the Biden administration epitomizes this problem. The main thinking in the National Security Council is we don't want Russia to escalate, because if Russia escalates, that would be really scary. Our voters will hate it, and who knows what's going to happen. Well, I don't want escalation either, but the result of our approach is that Putin does escalate, and then we lose. And the risks of inaction now, and I would argue the risks of inaction over the last 25 or 30 years are actually greater than the risks of action. And again, we choose inaction because we are ignorant, arrogant, naive, cynical, greedy, and I didn't even mention that, the enormous caviar express and the appalling, distorting effect that that's had on our decision-making with those bankers and lawyers and accountants who've been pumping money in to our political system and our public debate, saying there's no problem here, move along here, nothing to see. But most of all, because we were timid and scared, and Ukrainians are paying the price.
Thank you very much. I'll put a couple of questions to the panel now before we come to questions from the floor. And I'd like to start with you. I'm going to ask you in a moment what you think the West should do now. That's one of the questions we're going to try to answer this afternoon. But I wanted to begin by saying many people seem to have been inspired by the Ukrainians' response and the resistance to the invasion. In your most recent article for The Atlantic, you wrote, "The Ukrainians, especially their president, Volodymyr Zelensky, have made their cause a global one by arguing that they fight for a universal set of ideas, for democracy, yes, but also for a form of civic nationalism." Do you think that whatever the outcome of this war, that the Ukrainians' resistance can stand as some kind of force that will reinvigorate democracy beyond the country's borders too?
I hesitate to take it that far because our democracies, especially American democracy, which is I've been spent the last couple of months in Washington, is so battered and badly divided. But there is something very interesting about what Ukraine has shown all of us, and I think that applies to America and Europe and the UK. We've had, for the last decade or so, we've had a kind of culture war in the West between, on the one hand, liberal values, open society, ideas like that on the one hand, and then ideas about a sort of more muscular nationalism on the other. And these have been presented as opposites, and people have chosen sides, and there's been a deep divide as to which of those worldviews you choose. And what Zelensky has done, and the Ukrainians along with him, has shown us that there can be a muscular, patriotic defense of an open society, and Zelensky has bent over backwards to explain what he means by that. It's very interesting. I don't think there was anybody ever told the Ukrainians that in political science there are different kinds of nationalism, and people talk about ethnic nationalism and they talk about civic nationalism. And ethnic nationalism involves being attached to your ethnic identity, whether it's Ukrainian or Romanian or whatever. Civic nationalism is a different definition of, it's something closer to what we mean by patriotism. You believe in the nation state and the rule of law, and you're willing to defend it and so on. And as I said, I don't think anybody ever explained to the Ukrainians that there were these different kinds of nationalism, but by electing Zelensky, they chose it. And so we have a Jewish president of a bilingual country who speaks both languages. He himself is a native Russian speaker, but of course he speaks Ukrainian. But as you know, almost everybody in Ukraine speaks Russian and Ukrainian. I've been to public events in Kyiv where people switch back and forth. And whatever language you're comfortable with is the one that you speak. And so he has a deep understanding of what that means. And so he is demonstrating for us what that looks like. We are defending the rule of law, we are defending democracy, we are defending the right of these two languages to coexist in the same country. And I think all of those things have been quite moving to people in Europe and America, even if they don't quite know why. It is really interesting in the United States, where we've had these bitter partisan politics for the last decade, how this issue, of all issues, is the one that appears to be the most unifying. So I've seen numbers, 78% of Americans say they'll accept higher petrol prices if it means that we can help the Ukrainians and boycott Russian oil. I mean, I'm not sure I believe that's true. We'll see how people feel about that in a few months. But the impulse to admire him and to admire the country comes from, I think, our intuitive understanding of what it is that he's defending and what he's doing. So I don't know if he can fix our problems, but they're setting a really amazing example. Yeah,
it's remarkable when one thinks that he was elected because of his role in a TV sitcom, and people thought, well, why not? We're so fed up with our democratic leaders in the West, why not give it a go?
Just one point about the TV sitcom and Zelensky and the sitcom is that the role he played in that sitcom, I've watched it. It's very good. You can find it on YouTube. It's called Servant of the People, and you can find it.
It's going to be shown on TV here soon.
It's very good. But the interesting thing about it is his role. So he plays a kind of ordinary school teacher who's very put upon. He lives with his mother. He's divorced. He's a kind of loser. Everybody's mean to him. And then he accidentally becomes president. He starts ranting about corruption, and there's a little clip of him that goes viral and so on. But what's interesting is then as soon as he becomes president, everybody starts treating him differently. And they genuflect to him and back away when he walks in the room. And what he was making fun of in the movie was that old kind of Soviet idea of power. He was mocking people for having that. And he was suggesting to the Ukrainians that there could be a different kind of power. There could be a different kind of leadership. And I don't know how good he was at showing this as president in ordinary times, but in this, during this war, he's demonstrated what that means.
Edward,
just jumping very quickly on that. Anne and I both covered the revolutions of 1989, and I have a whiff of the sort of intoxicating excitement that we had in those years with people, particularly Václav Havel, but also for those who took the trouble to read it, the writings of Adam Michnik and some of the other great figures of that age. And we in the West felt perhaps not exactly ashamed, but we were sort of in awe of the way in which people who on the other side of the Iron Curtain seemed to believe in our values more than we did, and had made enormous sacrifices for them and articulated them better than our own leaders did. And I think there's a whiff of that with Zelensky too.
Thank you. Michael Bosikiu, if you can still hear us in Lviv, I wanted to ask you, you gave us a very, as I say, comprehensive overview of what was happening in the country as a whole. It seems that you are able to get information about what's happening in other parts of the country. How are you getting information? I wanted to ask you first, how clear a picture does the country as a whole have of the country as a whole?
Great question. Well, actually, it's pretty good. What's happened right now in the media space is something which is unprecedented in modern Ukrainian history. You'll recall that previous to the war, all the media, most of the big major media here were oligarch controlled and had their own vested interest, political interest. But what's happened during the start of hostilities is most of the stations have actually got together and do 24/7 kind of what they call here a marathon, reporting on what's going on. And I think, given the scarce resources and the fact that a lot of journalists have been scattered or had to go abroad or even into hiding, the quality of reporting is pretty good. And the way most Ukrainians get their information, including a lot of us, is through Telegram. There are various channels there with a lot of verified information, because another big campaign of the government and NGOs was to remind Ukrainians to double check your information and fact check everything. So the quality has been pretty good. If I could just briefly pick up on something Anne said about the TV show. I think also what we may see once hostilities calm down is where kind of reality or, fiction meets reality. And what I mean by that is a lot of the Ukrainians I'm talking to are looking at a post-war future where, for example, the pro-Russian oligarchs who controlled the economy, who plundered the economy, who scared away foreign investment, that they're going to be flushed out of the system here. Many of them possibly going to Russia, where they probably belong, or to Cyprus, or who knows where. So that would be a positive thing. I'm always looking for the silver lining. And the other thing is the pro-Russian parties that were in the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament here, some of them have now been banned, at least temporarily. But I don't think they're going to have much of a future in a post-war Ukraine. And don't forget that some of those politicians are still connected with the scandalized government of Yanukovych, and were even involved in the suppression of the Maidan protests. So we can possibly say farewell to them for good. And then I mentioned the media, the changes in the media, which are huge. And then finally, I think the fight against corruption will have a renewed vigor once everything is said and done here. So those are kind of positive things that a lot of Ukrainians believe will happen once hostilities subside here.
Thank you. So Michael Fallon, I want to come to you for your perspective as a former Defence Secretary. I mean, would it be true to say that in a sense we have both underestimated and overestimated the Russian military? Underestimated in the sense that we didn't realize or expect that their political masters in the shape of President Putin would order such a large-scale invasion, but also in a sense overestimated them for the fact that clearly, whatever the Kremlin's protest, this military campaign cannot possibly have gone to plan. As we pointed out more than once this evening, we're nearly a month in, and presumably this was supposed to be over much more quickly, wasn't it?
That was the intelligence, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that was the assessment made, that all this would be over in a matter of weeks. The major cities would be taken, and so on. So I think you're absolutely right. We've done both. We were mesmerized by this military machine, which turns out now to have some rather odd gaps in it. We haven't seen Russian air power. They have an air force. We haven't really seen that air force in action. We haven't seen combined operations, the combination of artillery and armour in a way that our experts were expecting. And we haven't seen much use, maybe coming, of the Black Sea. We haven't seen the naval operations that we might have expected to help cut off Berdyansk and Mariupol on the east and to take Odessa in the west. We haven't seen that either. So, we've been, I think our experts have been surprised by that. But of course, we were wrong about the whole thing, just as we were wrong about Crimea. At base, we didn't think Putin would do this.
I mean, I've been struck. I, as a correspondent, covered the wars in Grozny in the 1990s, and I imagined that the Russian military was far more efficient, having also been in Georgia than it was then. And yet, the day after the war started, I saw in the Times newspaper here in London on the 25th of February a picture of 2 young conscripts who'd been captured, and there was exactly the same scared faces I'd seen sort of 25 plus years earlier. Really, it seemed that very little had been learned in that sense. What I want to ask you next was, what prospect do you see of this conflict spreading beyond the war zone which we see now?
Well, just on your last point, I mean, there may be a difference between what happened in Chechnya and what's happening now, in that there may be a difference between what's happening in Chechnya and what's happening now, in that there is much more intelligence available, there is more public information, people can see what has been happening in some of these cities, thanks, of course, to the bravery of the media that's there, but also because modern communications and social media are there, much more prevalent perhaps than they were in Chechnya. And there is much more intelligence from the air of these various Russian movements, and it's easier for everybody, to kind of see the column of tanks and all the rest of it. I'm sorry, your second question was?
What's the prospects, do you think, of this spreading beyond the borders of Ukraine itself?
Well, if I lived in Transnistria, I'd be extremely worried. I noticed the Georgians have been very reluctant to get into this argument. And that is what Zelensky has been on about. If we don't call a halt to this here, then those countries too are extremely vulnerable. And you only have to look at Putin's rather rambling essay, to see what else may well be vulnerable. And that's why I think Poland is so important. I suspect when all this is over, Poland will be the new frontier state. And that is where we're going to have to concentrate our help, our defense, and our resources to make sure that their border is not threatened.
Come to questions very shortly, but before we do that, I just want to go around the panel once more and begin with you, Edward, if I may, and to try to begin to answer the question, what should the West do now? And I want to ask you particularly about sanctions. I mean, we've seen, for example, some very high-profile seizures of yachts. Chelsea Football Club, just about 4 miles from where we're sitting this afternoon, I see from a news alert I got just before we started discussing is the sale seems to be going ahead with increasingly higher bids. But are the sanctions you see so far hitting the right people?
No, and I'm afraid that sanctions largely fall into the category of something must be done, this is something, so let's do it and then clap ourselves on the back. Clearly, they haven't been enough because the war's still going on. And I think I'm particularly cross with the government for the way in which it announces, I mean, it's a very welcome rhetorical U-turn that we're clamping down on dirty money at last, going to reform Companies House at last, and so on. But the enforcement capability here is extremely weak, and I don't see any sign of the very big reboot that one would need for our criminal justice system actually to have the capability to do this. There's also a grave lack of expertise in our intelligence services about anything to do with financial flows, and the bit of MI5 that deals with hostile state activity, JSTAT, doesn't actually do anything involving money. So there's a good game being taught, but the reality is pretty feeble. I also think that doing asset seizures generally they're easy to announce, but there are property rights, people go to court. It's very hard to know who owns what, actually, so you end up with a sort of alphabet soup of different companies trying to work out which is the one that is actually owned by the person you're going after. There are things we could do to reform that, and my simple suggestion is that shell companies, those are companies where we have no beneficial ownership, should be unable to access the legal system unless you can produce a living, breathing owner or beneficial owner, then you can't make an enforceable contract, and that would immediately push them to the sidelines. So there's a few sort of radical things we could do, but the city would absolutely hate it, as would many people who are deeply associated with the Conservative Party, who we can't name because they're also extremely litigious, which is another problem. What I would concentrate on right now is visa bans, because there is no legal right to a visa. It's a pure smell test. And so I would take the top 1,000, or even better, the top 10,000 people in Russia and say you're all banned from coming to the Schengen zone, coming to Britain and Ireland, and from coming to North America. And not only that, your spouses, your siblings, your children, your parents, your in-laws are all banned. No more travel to the West for any of you. The way out of this is if you resign. So resign from the Duma, resign from the Federation Council, resign from your position in the ministry, resign your position, and your family can resume their studies at LSE. They can go on holiday to the south of France. They can continue all the things they're doing. That would be would be a proper, I wouldn't say devastating, but it would get the message across. And there's a great deal more we could do on cyber as well. Apple, Microsoft, and Android can basically turn any device that runs their software in Russia into a brick in the space of a few hours by pushing out an update that disables it. They don't want to do that because they say there's a kind of trust relationship between them and their users, and when you buy an Apple iPhone, you assume that Apple won't disable your iPhone for political purposes. To which I say, fine, if you feel like that, go to Mariupol. Go and melt some snow and worry that the water has got rotting corpses in it, and then come back and tell me how you feel. So there's a great deal more we could do. We could unleash the psyops. I've just been reading a wonderful book called Black Boomerang, which is the autobiography of Sefton Delmer, who invented our dark arts during the war. Copies, I won't recommend you go out and buy it, because I had to pay 160 quid for my copy. It's been out of print for a while. There's an enormous amount we could do to really mess with the minds of the Czechists and really disrupt things. But again, we don't want to do it because guess what? It'd be escalatory. So the people we have in this country and in the United States and elsewhere who've been working on these capabilities, who know how to do it, are sitting on their hands, chafing, because they won't get the political backing to unleash these capabilities. And meanwhile, Ukrainians are dying.
Thank you. Anne, what should the West's diplomatic, military, financial policy priorities be now?
So I'm not a military strategist. Sorry, I'm not a military strategist. I listen a lot to people who can tell you which particular weapons should be given to the Ukrainians. And I would bow to their greater knowledge. There certainly are more and different kinds of anti-missile weapons and anti-tank weapons that are much stronger than the ones that they have. But the main point is not which weapons we give them. The main point is that I think we're now at the stage in the war where we need to be clear about what our goal is and how the conflict should end. And we need to be planning for the ending, and the ending should be the victory of Ukraine. And by that, I just mean that Ukraine should remain a sovereign democracy, that it should have some confidence that the Russians will not come back soon over the borders, and that there will be some something. If the Ukrainians want to or feel able to, they want to, add some language about neutrality, if they want to discuss what their borders might be. That's up to them, and they should decide that. I don't think we can tell them that. There may be trade-offs they feel they can make. But we need to be thinking in terms of that as the end game and then working towards it. And so that means thinking about what weapons do we have to give them in order for them to prevent artillery battering their cities. How do we begin to advise them? How do we get them intelligence to push back the Russians, not merely to defend things, but we now need to push them back over the border. The more military progress that they make, the easier it will be to negotiate. So, I mean, it's not really a question in this war of diplomacy or war. I mean, the diplomacy will happen when facts change on the ground. So when the Russians feel they can't win, then they will negotiate differently from the way they do now. So, and one of the things I do worry is that it's not yet quite clear, certainly in Washington this is true, it's not yet quite clear in the minds of the White House or even the leadership of Congress that this is the end game or that it should be. And so getting people to recognize, I mean, most people, as you say, assumed this would be over in 3 days, including the National Security Council in Washington. Zelensky was offered a ride out of the country the first day of the war. And so having them overcome their assumption that the Russians will eventually win and begin to think about how the Ukrainians can win is the main goal. I mean, there is obviously, and we've mentioned this a little bit already, there is a lot of conversation about chemical and nuclear weapons and how to avoid the use of them, and I'm not downplaying those concerns, or and there are a lot of people who make arguments about what we can do that is or isn't escalatory in that sense, and I understand that has to be part of the consideration, but nevertheless, given those constraints, we need to be thinking about what the end game is, and I think that would change the way we are talking now about the war.
Thank you. I'd like to give Michael Bosicu the last word before we come to questions. But before I do that, so Michael Fallon, you've already suggested where you think we should go to. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Not a lot. I'm with Edward on sanctions and how sanguine he is about sanctions. I don't think sanctions have brought down regimes or actually reversed policy in history. I'm impressed by the extent to which the current sanctions actually do stretch right into the financial system, and I don't think we should underestimate that. But equally, there are weaknesses, of course, in that they still exclude oil and gas, and as long as they exclude oil and gas, then you're excluding Russia's principal source of revenue. We're paying Russia to wage war on a democracy, which seems to me an extraordinary position, and that has to be rethought. It's very, very difficult for the Italys, the Hungaries, the Germanys that depend on Russian oil and gas, but we've really got to find a way through that. On the military side, it's Zelensky It's Zelensky, as always, who's so clear about this. He said he didn't want a ride, he wanted ammunition. And ever since he said that, the military aid has been going in, and we need to do much more of that. There's nothing stopping us putting military aid in. They have the right to defend themselves. They have the right to ask their friends to help them defend themselves under international law. There's nothing wrong with us supplying weapons. We should be doing that, and we should be supplying more than weapons, the intelligence, the systems, the training that go with these weapons, and we should continue to do that. And as I understand it, our government has promised more help, and we should all be doing that. Finally, on chemical weapons, we need to think very hard about this. Are we really saying that if Russia uses chemical weapons, as Assad was allowed to use them in Syria, but then invited a strike from the Americans, are we really saying that they should be able to use chemical weapons with impunity against these cities? We need to think very, very hard about that. And we need to get some private messages to Russia that there are some red lines in this conflict that we're not prepared to accept.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I gather there is people in Washington are aware of that problem, and there is communication, and there are responses proposed that aren't made public. So I hope that's true.
Very interesting. Michael Bosicu, your chance to give the view from Lviv. What would you like to ask the West to do from here?
Sure. Well, very timely question, because President Biden is headed this way, not to Ukraine, but to Poland. But I think there are two or three things here that the West can still do. And I agree what's been said with sanctions so far. But if we could get to a point where if you're a Russian oligarch or anyone in Putin's circle, and the only place you can go to vacation is perhaps Pyongyang, or those artificial islands in the South China Sea being created by China, that'd be a very good place for us to move to in terms of our pressure on our allies. And don't forget also, Russians, a lot of them can freely still travel to many countries in the Gulf region, so they need to be worked on as well. In terms of response, I think we should also think about more funding, more effort going into the Russian media space, the Russian social media space, a lot more funding going in there to send information, facts to the Russian public, because I think the more these sanctions bite, the more they get these horrific casualty figures from the battlefield. They'll be looking for alternative sources of information. In terms of military support, much, much better intel, eyes in the sky for the Ukrainian armed forces, surface-to-air missiles, and especially the Switchblade drones, also known as kamikaze drones, some of which have already started to come from the United States. But these are very, very effective on the Ukrainian side in the battlefield. They can be carried in a backpack, sent up in the air and towards a target. There's the thousands of people signing up for the territorial force, and there's still a lot of people going into these forces, these volunteer forces, with just a baseball cap and a t-shirt, believe it or not. So a lot more body armor, a lot more helmets. Finally, I think, kind of generally speaking, I think if the West doesn't move quickly and set its own terms in terms of response to what's going to happen in this war, we're going to be left in a position where we have to deal with the terms set by Mr. Putin. And sadly, in that interim period, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands more Ukrainians will die needlessly. So I think it's very important that, again, Western leaders develop the spine to stand up to Mr. Putin, put aside these threats, and end this war once and for all. And in the process, saving thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of innocent lives. One final point, I also see what's happening from my position here in Lviv, that because of the lack of, I think, Western resolve and Western spine, what the Ukrainian leadership is now doing is searching for micro-alliances with like-minded states. You saw three or four prime ministers come here the other day, all the way into Kyiv by train for talks with the Zelensky administration. You're seeing more closeness between Kyiv and the Baltic countries. So that's going to continue, because I think the decision has pretty much been made even before hostilities started that Ukraine has to move to tighter alliances with neighboring states in order to protect itself from a common enemy, that being Russia.
Okay, thank you. We'll come to questions from the floor. I think we have microphones. If you could wait for the microphones to come, and if you could please introduce yourself and say if you're addressing your question to anyone in particular or to the panel in general. Thank you very much. Start with the gentleman over there, please.
Hi. This is for Anne. In your introduction, you emphasized that it's not just Putin personally, but the people around him. Could you elaborate a bit more on how Russia's interests and actions might change if, say, Putin was off the stage tomorrow?
Well, this is, of course, one of the questions that I'm asked 9 times a day, which is who would replace Putin, and is there a mechanism for getting rid of him? And the answer is, I don't know, and I don't know. What we do know about Putin is that whereas a few years ago, he had a lot of relationships in Moscow, you would meet people in Moscow who had recently seen him. He was part of a large community. He appeared at events and so on. Over the last 2 years, because of COVID, he has been very much in a bunker. He's mostly surrounded by his bodyguards, some of whom apparently ideologically agree with him. And he doesn't have a lot of contact even with the Russian oligarchs who are so important in that country. And so he's very cut off. He's come up with this, he's been reading these crazy, I don't even know where they're coming from, historical documents and manuscripts that have given him a very strange view of Russian and Ukrainian history. And so it's very hard to, and he's not sharing those views with anybody except via these pronouncements and statements and public appearances. The trouble in Russia is also that the problem isn't even just that we don't know who would replace him. We don't know by what mechanism that person would be chosen. So even in the Soviet era, there was a Politburo. So there was a clear, and there was a Soviet Communist Party, and there was a hierarchy there, and there were other people, and we knew what their roles were. Putin, particularly in the last couple of years, has become much more isolated. There isn't an intermediate mechanism, in the way that there was in the past, and so it's very difficult to say. I mean, having said all that, it's certainly true that years ago, I once read an article where I went back and looked up obituaries of Russian leaders. And one of the amusing things was I found an obituary of Stalin from the Times of London from 1953. And there was a line in there that said something like, well, now he's gone, and now the hardliners waiting in the wings are going to take over. I mean, what hardliners? Who's harder line than Stalin? And that we have a little bit of that attitude. I've even heard that about Putin. Oh, well, Putin is, I'm sure there are people who are much worse. No, actually, of course, a change would be better because you would have somebody who would have a different attitude to events. But I actually don't think we should think that way. I don't think it's useful to think about, who changes power in Russia or who's in control. I think we should. There's a lot of wishful thinking about that. I think we should focus on, as I've said, winning the war, as Edward has said, increasing the sanctions so that they become the kinds of sanctions that people actually feel. And I think that will have a longer and more useful effect.
It is instructive to read old newspaper reports sometimes. For my last book, I wrote about the reporting of the show trials in the 1930s, and in the Times then you could read the court report and then it would say obituary page X because the person in the trial had been shot that same night. And that was before the hardliners even came on the scene.
Hi, can I abuse the mic in the corner? Yeah.
Please.
So two quick questions. I am intuitively understand the kind of language around both an unwillingness to escalate and the question of red lines. But I'd like to ask just the sort of specific question so that everybody can kind of not be vague about that question, because I think specificity around these things really matters in terms of what may happen. So the first question is, if you were to articulate what a red line would be, what exactly would a red line be that should cause the West to act? And then if the West were to act, what specifically should the West do if a red line is crossed, so that we can understand what that is, and then related to that, how do we think Russia would respond if we were to specifically act in relation to a crossed red line?
Edward, would you like to have a go answering that first, please?
I think the red line's already been crossed. I think the red lines have been crossed for years and years. I think using a nerve agent in Salisbury was a red line. Using polonium in central London was a red line. I think bombing apartment blocks in order to come to power was a red line. And we can choose how much we mind about these things, but after they've happened, it's too late. I think that the use of chemical weapons in Syria was a sort of red line, but in the end we didn't really do anything. And I'm quite cautious about this whole discourse, because what happens if you say, it's a bit like what the United States has been saying, which is don't attack any NATO countries because that's a red line. Well, that basically says you can attack Moldova and Georgia and continue attacking Ukraine and we won't mind about it. So I don't like this idea of drawing lines in the sand, because it implies everything that's on the other side of the line is okay, and it's not.
I would only add to that. I mean, I do think we should have prepared, and I do know that this is happening. I mean, we should have prepared responses. If there are chemical weapons used in Ukraine, we should have a response ready to go. And obviously, the same goes for nuclear.
I would say, for example, a very major military exercise in the Baltic would be a good idea right now. I slightly disagree with Sir Michael that Poland is a very big, strong country. The Baltic states is 7 million people on a thin, flat strip of land with no natural frontier. And we need completely to rethink our defence of the Baltics, and we should start practicing that right now with going over to deterrence by denial rather than deterrence by punishment. I'd also like to see Royal Navy and US Navy warships in the Black Sea. I don't understand why, as soon as this was looming, we should have said we're going to have a continuous presence of of powerful naval vessels in Ukrainian ports. I don't think you can get there without inconveniencing us. It's all terribly late now, and the real answer to your question is, it's like directions in Ireland. I wouldn't start from here. We've left ourselves where everything we do is going to be extremely painful, very risky, leave us a lot poorer and a lot less safe.
Michael Bosick, could I bring you? Yes, please. Yeah. Please come in there, because I would like to know how this discourse about red lines looks from where you're sitting.
Yeah, so I think I would have thought a red line would have been crossed on July 17th, 2014, when MH17 was shot down and 298 innocent souls were killed. I would have thought that a red line would have been crossed when Crimea was illegally annexed. I would have thought a red line was crossed about a week ago when the Russians bombed the heck out of that hospital where there was a maternity ward and a children's ward. and among others, a pregnant mother and her child died. I think what Mr. Putin is very adept at doing is probing for soft tissue and then digging deeper. What I mean by that, even during the depths of the pandemic, when the European Union couldn't come together and agree on simple, relatively simple things like border closures. You'll recall the WHO was insisting that the EU work together for trade and travel restrictions. They didn't. So I think this was watched very carefully in Moscow and also in Beijing. And the moment they sniff disunity, the moment they sniff that the West is distracted by things like COVID or economic problems, then they move. And it's very sad that we have to say this, is that there are no clear red lines at the moment. And even if there were, I don't know if we would see the unity that a harsh response would require.
Thank you. You mentioned Beijing, Michael. I see Isabel Hilton from China Dialogue in the audience. Isabel, and it's very difficult to guess what might be going through Chinese policymakers' minds at the moment. Was there any thoughts you might share? Because obviously just prior to this, we saw that great show of friendship between President Putin and Xi Jinping.
Absolutely. Well, the February the 4th statement of limitless friendship, 5,000 words of it. And the question is, why, given that Putin was there with Xi Jinping, what did Putin tell Xi Jinping, and what did Xi decide to do about it? It seems extraordinarily unlikely he didn't tell him that he was going to invade Ukraine. Given that, it seems quite puzzling that Xi Jinping made no effort to evacuate the 6,000 Chinese citizens who were in Ukraine, some of them building the metro in Kyiv, some of them students, some of them have been renovating ports on the Black Sea. But at day 2 of hostilities, the Ukrainian ambassador, the Chinese ambassador in Ukraine, bless him, advised Chinese citizens that if they had to go out, they should put a Chinese flag on the car because everyone so loved China that they would be fine, like some medieval talisman. 2 days after that, with desperate Chinese students calling parents saying, "How do I get out of here?" He had to revise his advice to maybe not the flag, and actually, please don't go out. And yes, we will try and get you out of here. So it seems likely that Xi Jinping believed that this was going to be a quick hit, as Putin may himself have believed. Since then, however, the internal discourse in China, including on social media, has been savagely pro-Russian. I mean, really vile stuff on social media. And at the official level, very much blaming the United States for causing this, the expansion of NATO and so on. The call between Xi and Biden was billed and described by experts in Beijing as Biden desperately reaching out to Xi Jinping to help him get out of the mess that he had created. So you can see this is not very promising. And when people say China can act as an interlocutor and an intermediary, China has very little experience of doing this. I think only in the six-party talks in North Korea did it really play a kind of useful role. But the kind of mobilization and knocking heads together that a real intermediary needs to do, China doesn't do. And it's completely compromised with support for Putin. They share a worldview, which is that the United States is the principal enemy. They share a worldview in the belief that the West is decadent and that a new era is dawning, particularly China's perspective is that a new era is dawning, and that democracy, liberal democracy is coming to an end. So China is trying to maintain an external experience of impression of neutrality, whilst signing new deals for gas supply from Russia, and by the time the European Union stops buying oil and gas from Russia, China will have the infrastructure to take up the slack. So that would be a relatively seamless transition. I would doubt that they will supply arms directly, because I think they wouldn't want to be caught doing that. But apart from that, I can't see them leaning on Russia at all in any helpful way. And it would be quite a difficult, reverse position for Xi Jinping, who is trying to consolidate his own political position in advance of a critical party congress at the end of the year, when his term, he hopes, will be renewed and so on. He has to maintain this impression of being the wise and beloved and infallible leader, and dumping Putin isn't really on the cards in that sense.
Thank you. Anyone on the panel care to respond to that, the possible future role of China? I think pretty comprehensive assessment from Isabel.
Never argue with Isabel about China.
Thank you. The gentleman here, please.
Thank you all. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who worked for European Union programs in Kiev just after the Orange Revolution and just before and after the Maidan. And I hope everybody in this room takes away the comments Sir Michael and Edward Lucas made about incompetence, cynicism, greed. Those were not the EU's finest hours. Britain can hold its head up fairly high, but I saw dreadful things which should not have happened. We let Ukraine down. My question for you all is, if you had 5 minutes to ask questions while looking them in the eye to Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel, and Olaf Scholz, what questions would you like to ask? I particularly ask that in view of the look on his face in the photograph of Chancellor Scholz with President Biden in the White House when President Biden said there will be no Nord Stream 2. I saw what was in Scholz's eyes. Thank you.
Who'd like to answer that? Sir Michael Fallon, perhaps you might be the one who's most likely to be in the position to put those questions, so, albeit hypothetically, what do you think should be our policy suggestions? Come to Anne in a moment.
Very difficult. I mean, you've left Biden off the list. I would certainly like to talk to Biden and ask him what on earth he was playing at in the way that he signalled by his rapid withdrawal from the announcement on Afghan in the summer, his announcement he wouldn't be penalising American companies after all for working on Nord Stream, the chaos over Kabul, the misuse of words about some incursion into Ukraine might be all right as long as it wasn't an invasion and so on. Really, I think the American leadership, I'm afraid to say this, has been very, very disappointing in respect of this. What I would say to Macron is, what did you really believe that? Did every previous French president really believe it? And I'm afraid it's probably true that we all wanted to believe it. That they all went to Moscow, all of them. Hollande went to Moscow, Merkel went endlessly, Blair went, Cameron went. They all went to Moscow. They all wanted to believe. It's like the shadows in Plato's cave. They wanted to believe that Putin was genuinely different, and he wasn't. And I'd just like to eyeball them and say, why were you really so naive?
I don't actually put those three people, I wouldn't put those three people all in the same category. I think Olaf Scholz, for example, has behaved very well. He's somebody who came into office as chancellor with really no foreign policy experience at all. He'd never met Putin. And he has understood the scale of what has happened. Yes, but he didn't have any time before the event. He wasn't involved with these issues, and I think you can recognize that what he's done is quite extraordinary in German terms, and turning around the country and changing the language about self-defense and so on is very important. And so I put him in a very different category, for example, from Merkel, who did believe for a long time that she had a special relationship with Putin and that she was able to talk to him and that she was able to kind of keep him in control. She was the one leader who spoke to him most often, and he has a special thing about Germany, and she played into that. And so, I would put her in a different category, and then I would put Macron also in a different category. So I'm not sure they've all played similar roles. And I also have to say that I think that some of what Biden has done, in the last several months has been truly admirable. I think the use of American intelligence, the decision to reveal it, the way in which he galvanized the alliance, starting in November, and warned people about what was coming. And I know for a fact that there was an argument about this at the CIA. I mean, are you allowed to publicize intelligence like that? And they decided to do it, which was important. And I think he's made it clear how important this is, and I think he understands the stakes. So I'm not sure I put them all in the same category of failure and blame.
Yeah,
Let me please give the word first to Michael Bosicu and see if he's... what would he say to the European leaders if you had the chance to look them in the eye and put a question to Michael?
I wouldn't necessarily put them all in the same room either, but if I were, I'd throw my Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, in there for good measure. Recently, during a European tour, Prime Minister Trudeau famously said, well, actually, we have more and better tools than military. The power we have built up over the past 75 years of unprecedented peace and stability around the world we have the tools to damage the Putin regime far more effectively than we ever could with tanks and missiles. Well, I'm not so sure about that because, we saw how ineffective sanctions have been on Mr. Putin. One thing I would ask them, whether if things continue and more red lines are crossed, whatever those may be, whether they consider removing Russia from the UN Security Council, their permanent seat. There is some sort of precedent for this. You remember with China way back, the seat was switched. But that's something that I think a serious discussion should begin on. Having said that, as we've seen with other international fora, such as the G7, G8, Russia doesn't seem to care very much anymore about being part of these international institutions that have been built over the years. So again, that puts us in a tough place as, Western democracies, but that's something I would ask them.
Edward.
Yes, I think they are all in different categories. I think what I would ask Scholz to do is to talk to the German left. Because one of the things that really puzzles me about this is I can kind of understand for people who take a sort of old-fashioned maybe nostalgic for empire point of view, perhaps the sort of Peter Hitchens conservatives, that the big countries always do what they want, small countries have to get out of the way or they get hurt, and in the end, we all do this sort of thing, so let's not get too het up about it. I don't agree with that, but I can understand that there's a sort of slice of opinion somewhere on the conservative right, and certainly not on your side, but there are people who rather hanker after Putinist tactics. We see it in the Republican Party, the Tucker Carlson types. And I can also understand what you might call the greedy middle, the sort of people who I won't mention them here because they're all very litigious, but the sort of people who have made a huge amount of money and say in the end it's all just about making money, so let's not get in the way of business. What really puzzles me is the idealistic European left, who are so hot on anti-imperialism, are so aware of every little failing of Western capitalism, of Western, Iraq and Afghanistan. Actually, they were demanding intervention in Afghanistan before they were against it. But there's this huge swathe of liberal-minded, left-wing European opinion, which absolutely gets the importance of minority languages and minority cultures, hates the way in which the sins of empire are forgotten by the former imperialists. And it seems to me this conflict is tailor-made for them to get really cross about. They should be the biggest supporters. Here you have a former colony which is being ruthlessly bullied by an imperial power who's exploited them horrendously. I mean, it makes what the European colonial empires did, and goodness knows that was bad, but what the Russians, the Soviets did to Ukraine, which Anne has written about so brilliantly in her book Red Famine, is really up there in the worst colonial crimes in history. And why is it that we're still, the European left particularly, and to some extent also the American left, is so sort of crazed with self-loathing and self-hatred for what the West has done, that they can't see that everything they hate about capitalism and imperialism is there in spades in the way the Putin regime is treating its own people and treating its neighbours. So that, I mean, Scholz would not be guilty of that himself, but perhaps as leader of the German Social Democrats, he might like to pass the message on.
Thank you. We've just got time for one or two more questions. Just the gentleman here and then the lady down here in the front row, please.
Thanks. My name's Barney Jones. I worked for the BBC for many years. I have no specialist knowledge in this area, although I've worked in Kyiv and in Moldova training journalists since I left the Beeb, and I've met Putin a couple of times too. But my question is very specifically to Michael Fallon. If you were in that ugly fortress next to the House of Commons now, what would you be saying to your most senior military people there? What would you be asking Oppos and the Pentagon about ways that the West could be creative in helping Ukraine militarily? What further weaponry could be given? I mean, is it fantasy to think of weapons? It doesn't seem to me that the problem is money, is in delivering stuff. The problem is the geopolitics of not actively getting in that territory. But are there more weapons? Are there ships that we could hand to Ukrainians and say, get in there, use what we've got? Are there more clever things the West could be doing?
Well, the first response to that, the first thing I think I would be saying...
So Mike.
Third time I've done that. The first thing I think I would be saying to the generals inside the MOD, and indeed to the politicians, is this isn't stuff we should be talking about. We should not really be discussing military aid. We should be doing it. We should not be publicizing it. What's really important is these weapons get into the hands of the Ukrainian army, not that particular governments around the world should claim credit for supplying 1,000 of this or 500 of that. And, you know, I think that's far better in helping the Ukrainians, that the Russians don't exactly know who is supplying what. So I would take it completely off the airwaves. Secondly, you're right. I mean, we have a huge inventory here. And, you know, the others do too, the French particularly. We have a huge inventory. And there is plenty there that can be simply gifted. One of the reasons, and there were other reasons, I'm afraid, why we did not supply weapons in 2014, because we had a coalition government. But one of the reasons it was so difficult to supply weapons was we had absurdly strict rules about gifting. When the Ukrainians wanted anti-tank weapons in a hurry, you had to lay papers before the House of Commons, and they had to lay there for 30 days before you could make the supply and all that. So I would look into that and get all that completely speeded up, so that we could actually, as you suggested, gift some of our equipment without worrying about the particular value of it. And thirdly, I'd be looking at some of the more specialist stuff, the offensive cyber capability that we have, some of the missile systems that we have that we're now starting to think about supplying, some to Poland, but some of the more sophisticated weaponry that we have, I would start supplying that.
Thank you very much. And last question to the lady in the front row, please.
I'm not sure if it is on. Carol Allen Story. I'm a photojournalist, and one of the things that the discussion today is scary in terms of what we didn't do, and perhaps where is the optimism? So the question to the panel is, looking at this president that probably most of the world could not pronounce his name or knew who he was, and all of a sudden everyone knows who Zelensky is, and the kind of leadership and the kind of role that he's playing from the very beginning of the soundbite, perhaps as part of his training as being an actor and so on. You know, I don't need a free ride, I need weapons and so on. How important do you think Zelensky is right now in being able to weave perhaps a magic wand to get the West really behind what is required, and for them to rethink and strategize what is the best way forward, rather than being locked into the old way of doing things?
Would you like to answer that first? How important is President Zelensky himself?
Zelensky is obviously very important. He's somebody who, partly because of what he did most of his life and the people he's surrounded with, he has a very good sense of how to communicate, and he's, he's well prepared to do it, and also I think his feelings are authentic, and you can tell. But I also think that the one of the most inspiring things coming out of this war is also the behavior of a lot of ordinary Ukrainians, people who aren't the president. Very ordinary people who've gone to help in the territorial army, several people who I know who stayed in Kiev in order to be either work as journalists or to help in either with refugees or even with just food distribution. You know, the way in which the country has galvanized is truly impressive. And, you know, all of us in this room, you know, live in very divided societies where we have partisan debates all the time, and we should be inspired by the unity of the Ukrainians.
Thank you. Sir Michael?
Thank you. Yes, I think we should applaud Zelensky for the moral clarity he's brought to all this, for the shaming of the West that he's developed in his addresses to the different parliaments around the world, and not so much for galvanizing the rest of the world, but for galvanizing his own people, for galvanizing that sense of national identity, which I've seen growing in Ukraine, actually, fostered by the way that Russia has behaved in the Donbass. But he has really crystallized it and galvanized it. I think finally Zelensky actually, you know, is a beacon of hope in one other respect. Ukraine was a very immature, corrupt, clunky democracy dominated by oligarchs. Actually, democracy in the end worked. You know, they threw out the oligarchs. Zelensky got elected, and we shouldn't forget that. And that, you know, that is what the Ukrainians are fighting for, and that is what we should be supporting them in.
Edward Lucas, final thought from you.
Hands up everyone in the audience who knows the name of the Ukrainian Prime Minister. Not Bishop, you can't do that. Anyone apart from Bishop Kenneth, who is the Ukrainian bishop here in London, who know, yes, okay, so we've got, so I think that rather proves the point. He's actually Denis Shmyhal, and our own dear Defence Minister was easily fooled when this man appeared on the, to do a video call, and it was in fact a Russian prankster. So it's a huge burden, but I have to say, I slightly, you know, I've spent a lot of time looking at desperate messages from people who really believed in our values and who were let down. When I was writing my book, Deception, I found a message sent by the Lithuanian partisans who were fighting Soviet occupation in 1946, and they were appealing to us, citing the values of the Atlantic Charter, and saying, if you really believe in these values, why are you leaving us to be massacred in the woods by the NKVD? There's messages from the Warsaw Uprising from 1944. There's the famous radio broadcast, which many of you will have heard, because it's used every time the Hungarian uprising is on the radio, of the message, the last, I think, yes, the last message in English from Hungary as the Soviet tanks rolled in. And I didn't want to be in a position where we are sitting there admiring the extraordinary courage of an amazing leader in absolutely terrible circumstances. He shouldn't be in these circumstances. Ukrainians shouldn't be in these circumstances. And it's almost a kind of, it's not quite war porn, it's sort of disaster porn, that we sit there luxuriating in this sort of extraordinary political moment where we see you know, him telling the Germans, "Nie wieder," telling and tear down the wall, telling the British, we'll fight them on the beaches, which is what he meant to say. Unfortunately, his interpreter mistranslated, said we'll fight them on the shores, which doesn't sound quite so good. And it's all wonderful. We should just, again and again, I want to finish on this, we should be asking ourselves, why did we leave him to be the last best hope?
Thank you.
Could I just
and
chime
yes,
in
and the
very
last
quickly?
word to you, please, yeah.
Thank you. I always love having the last word. Yeah, it's very interesting to watch the wave of popularity of Zelensky globally, because I think there's a little bit of a different view here, especially in Western Ukraine, which, by the way, was not very pro-Zelensky during the election, was more pro-Poroshenko. It's going to be interesting to watch how Zelensky and Poroshenko reconcile the differences. Poroshenko is on the news every night here, oftentimes in battle fatigues. And don't forget that pre-war, the Zelensky government was trying to prosecute Mr. Poroshenko for treason. So hopefully those internal differences will be resolved. I also would like to see Mr. Zelensky make, for example, much more effective use of his very skilled diplomatic service. By the way, a lot of them are women, especially the ambassador in the United States, people like that, because he does have a very tight inner circle, and he does tend to go through ministers very quickly, and he has dispensed of a lot of technocrats early on in his administration. And one more quick thing, Mr. Zelensky will need a lot of support from the West henceforth. And I'm thinking especially by a bigger power such as China. Earlier this year, or actually a few months ago, China tried to strong-arm Zelensky, forcing Ukraine to take its name off a UN human rights petition criticizing China's treatment of the Muslim minority. Otherwise, they were going to stop a shipment of 250,000 COVID vaccines bound for Ukraine. That's the way they act. So Zelensky is going to have a heck of a lot on his plate, including reconstruction, things like that. But we all hope, of course, that things turn out for the best and that he's able to use a lot of the support that the West has promised to rebuild a even stronger democracy than existed before. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael Bosacule, joining us from Lviv. Thank you too to Edward Lucas, Sir Michael Fallon and Applebaum. Thank you very much to the Conduit and to Pranvira Smith for organising. And thank you very much for your participation, for your questions, both here and online. Thank you.